Bob, you are one of the many experts I spoke with before I went out there and commented at all on this thing months ago. And you tell me whether I have overstated the draconian nature of this law.
No, the scenario you set up is absolutely spot on as far as what this law does. There's no question about it. When a bill uses terms like emergency custody and describes, what would warrant a court taking emergency custody in a case, you got to pay attention. I mean, it defines gender affirming care, which the bill puts in the category of neglect or abuse, warranting emergency custody by a judge. And it defines gender affirming care, which is a total euphemism. I mean, gender, what's caring? That's gender. You're denying care. That's what the Minnesota narrative has been crafted into this bill. And it's defining it to include the very things you talked about, any kind of hormone blockers, any kind of, and it's the classic scenario. This has happened. This is not just a theory. I mean, Washington Examiner reported on this thing with Abigail Martinez's daughter, who was put on testosterone hormones and ended up throwing herself in front of a train, and they had to pick up her pieces. And this has happened. This is a nightmare for people in Minnesota and anyone whose kid might end up there.
Matt, what's your take?
Yeah, I agree. And in fact, I take it one step further, Megyn. Not only would this apply if a girl is in Minnesota, but let's say you have a young lady living in Ohio and she has a woke aunt that says, you know what, I think you would benefit from puberty blockers and hormones. Let's take you to Minnesota. So she can now transport this minor to Minnesota and use this law to get custody of the girl and then start making decisions saying, I'm going to put you on the blockers. I'm going to put you on the hormones. I'm going to get you these surgeries, undermining that girl's parental rights back home in Ohio. So not only is this an affront to kids in Minnesota and harming them, but across the country, parents now have to worry about someone taking their child to Minnesota and stripping away their custody and their ability to protect kids from these dangerous drugs and surgeries.
So God forbid, Bob, this happened to me. Now I live in Connecticut. And suddenly my kids were, a child of mine were in Minnesota, and somebody, because it doesn't even have to be a relative that gets, it could be like Planned Parenthood that files the petition and says, we want to get this kid here in Minnesota. So now my husband and I remain in Connecticut. We are outraged. Where's our child? Who the hell filed a petition to get them into the jurisdiction of a court in Minnesota? And they're in Minnesota physically right now, and God knows what's going to happen. We would normally go to a court in Connecticut where we live, where, let's presume in this hypothetical, thank God, scenario, there's a psychiatrist who sees the child, and there's a teacher and everybody who's looking after the child's mental health along with my husband and me. And we would say to a Connecticut court, go give us our child back. Like, please issue a subpoena that we can run into Minnesota with saying, give us our child back. And that's how it would work in virtually all circumstances if somebody were to take your kid across state lines and try to keep him or her from you. But Bob, you tell me what would happen if we went to Minnesota with that subpoena from Connecticut thanks to this law.
Well, and in Minnesota, in dealing with abuse situations, and that's how this has been categorized by the bill. Mm-hmm. In dealing with abuse situations, you can imagine it's warranted for the court in the place where the child is found to be. If the child's immediate safety is at risk, then the court takes on jurisdiction for the safety of the child. So by putting this scenario into the category of cases that warrant exclusive and emergency jurisdiction, they are cutting out the Connecticut court, saying we have the kid here. The kid's at risk of harm, immediate harm, warranting our jurisdiction, so you don't have any. That's exactly what this bill does. Because they
consider abusive not to give the kid this so-called gender-affirming care.
Right. Exactly. That's what they've categorized. And to say that it's only for outstate kids is a bald-faced deception. I mean, if this is what warrants abuse in Minnesota, how do all parents in Minnesota think that this is not going to be used to measure their own family's situation in state? I mean, you can't say this is abuse for kids outside the state, but we're not going to protect, because that's the language now. We're not going to protect kids in the state. We're not going to apply this. No, you have an equal protection problem immediately. So you say you're protecting kids, you can't apply it to kids who are from other states and not your own kids. Mm-hmm. So I mean, it's a bald-faced lie to say this isn't going to be applied to Minnesota kids. It's a standard that they've established now for neglect or abuse warranting emergency jurisdiction. And this is the scariest scenario. I mean, we've got, this has happened already in other states. And Walz, I mean, South Dakota outlawed these measures, these kind of treatments, along with the whole country of Sweden, who is way ahead of us on this. They did a full study, follow-up study of patients who went through trans surgery and treatments, and found that their suicide rate was 19 times higher. 19 times, not percent, 19 times higher than the average. And they banned all these things because they didn't want to hurt children. I don't know why Governor Walz, what he has against children, but it's pretty apparent.
Yeah. And let's just look at the language of the statute, Matt. It's HR 146, and it reads as follows in part: temporary emergency jurisdiction. A court of this state has temporary emergency jurisdiction if the child is present in this state and, sub 3, the child has been unable to obtain gender-affirming health care as defined in section 543.23 paragraph B. What does that 543.23 paragraph B says? What does it say about gender-affirming health care? Gender-affirming health care means, quoting from the statute, medically necessary health care or mental health care that respects the gender identity of the patient as experienced and defined by the patient, and that may include but is not limited to 1, interventions to suppress the development of endogenous secondary sex characteristics, meaning puberty blockers. 2, interventions to align the patient's appearance or physical body with the patient's gender identity. 3, interventions to alleviate the patient's symptoms of clinically significant distress resulting from gender dysphoria. And it goes on from there. That covers all of it. Puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, surgeries, period.
Yeah, it's absolutely terrifying. So you play out this scenario. Imagine you've got a mom and dad, and like you described, a young girl that she's maybe on the spectrum. She's dealing with confusion, anxiety, depression, other things. And the parents say, let's put a pause. Let's wait and see. And let's try and treat the other things first. What, as Bob was saying, so many European countries are doing, so many U.S. states are doing, is prioritizing good mental health care over this medicalization. But under this law, Minnesota courts now have the authority to use that emergency jurisdiction language you cited, and saying, because mom and dad, you will not give these girls puberty blockers, hormones, these dangerous, potentially sterilizing surgeries. We're going to take jurisdiction, and we're going to start deciding this is medically necessary, and immediately putting her on drugs, now allowing her to access these surgeries and everything else that comes with this. And as Bob said, this is not a hypothetical. We've actually had a case just across the state line from Minnesota in Wisconsin, where a school district there was socially transitioning a girl, pushing this teenage girl that was dealing with depression and anxiety during all of the COVID crisis, and pushing this girl towards embracing a male identity, hiding it from the parents, refusing the parents when they then tried to intervene and protect their daughter. So this law takes what's happening in Wisconsin and other states like it and magnifies it so that now the judges can order these kids to be put on these drugs and surgeries, and the parents back home have no recourse. They can't get a subpoena. They can't do anything to protect their kid under this law. And that's ultimately going to do a lot of damage to kids in Minnesota and across the country that are going to continue to be damaged by this harmful gender ideology.
Did you know that there is nearly $1 trillion of infrastructure and pandemic funds yet to be spent? That's right. There's a massive amount of money that this lame duck administration is pushing hard to spend in their last few months. If the president is able to push these funds out, we could see another prolonged inflation surge, just like we did during COVID. But there's hope. A gold IRA from Birch Gold Group can be an inflation hedge for your savings in uncertain times. To see how to protect your IRA or 401k, get your free info kit on gold by texting MK to 989898. Birch Gold makes it seamless to roll over your retirement account while preserving your tax-advantaged status. Don't wait for the president's spending spree to potentially tank the dollar further. Protect your financial future right now. Text MK to the number 989898 for your free info kit from Birch Gold. Thanks so much for watching. If you like what you just saw, hit the subscribe button for more clips and full episodes.